Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something really fascinating, digging into the spiritual world of the ancient Yamnaya people.
That's right. And specifically, we're looking at potential connections threads, really stretching from them to major world religions like Vedic Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, and maybe even Tengrism.
It's based on a source one of you sent in, curious about how these big religious ideas might have originated and spread across Eurasia. The source itself is Source Text Yamnaya, source of majorreligions.pdf by humanist pastor James Dolton.
hmm And our goal here is to, well, understand the Yamnaya themselves a bit better, their beliefs, their world, and then carefully explore the scholarly theories linking them to these later traditions.
Carefully being the key word, right? We're talking about deep prehistory here, so some connections will be clearer than others. We want to trace that journey through time, but be clear about what's solid evidence versus more speculative links.
Exactly. It's a journey across thousands of years and vast landscapes. So let's start at the beginning. Who were the Yamnaya?
Okay, so the source puts them chronologically around 3300 to 2600 BCE, but they didn't just appear, did they? They came from somewhere.
Right. They largely developed from the preceding Rippin culture. And the Rippin culture itself is really interesting. It's a Copper Age society, 4th millennium BC, living on the Pontic Caspian steppe and the East European forest steppe.
And the Repan folks, they're important because...
Well, for a couple of reasons. First, they're not just ancestral to the Yamnaya, but also seem to be ancestral to the Afanasevo culture, way over in Mongolia.
Afanasevo, that name rings a bell. Weren't they linked to the Tacharians?
Precisely. The thinking is that the Afanasevo separation from Repin represents a very early split, perhaps the pre-Tocharian language branching off from an early form of Proto-Indo-European, or PIE.
Wow, okay, so we're talking about the very roots of these language families splitting apart. And the Ripan culture itself, what was their world like?
They were developing out of even earlier groups, like the Sredni Stog culture. They lived in this steppe and forest steppe zone. Interestingly, this area had some really early ceramics, going back to maybe 6000 BC, associated with mobile hunter-gatherer-fisher groups.
So a long history of people adapting to that environment. What about their spiritual life, or at least what can we infer? The source mentions Kurgans.
Yes, the Kurgan burial mounds are a huge marker. We see them with Ripon, Yamnaya, and Afanasevo. These earthen mounds built over graves definitely suggest shared ideas about death, the afterlife, maybe honoring ancestors.
And what else? Any clues about gods?
There's strong evidence pointing towards veneration of a sky god. This fits perfectly with the reconstruction of the Proto-Indo-European chief deity, Dies Fustar.
The Sky Father, the ancestor of Zeus, Jupiter, Diaspitar.
Exactly that one. So that idea seems quite ancient in this cultural complex. We also see wheeled wagons appearing.
Mobility. That fits the steppe narrative.
Absolutely. It points to their lifestyle. They hunted quite a bit. Antelope, moose, wild goats, even bear and fox. But pastoralism was really central.
Sheep, goats, cattle.
Pigs, and critically horses. Horse meat seems to have been important, but more than that, this region is considered one of the earliest places for horse breeding and domestication. They might have even been exporting horses south to the Caucasus.
So horses were key to their nomadic or semi-nomadic life.
Definitely. Driven by seasonal pastures, supported by their horses, wagons, and dogs. They weren't just simple nomads, though. The source mentions metallurgy. They were extracting copper from local sandstone deposits, making tools, ornaments.
Okay, and back to the burials for a second. What were they like inside the Kurgans?
Typically inhumation. The body placed in a pit, usually in a crouched supine position, so on their back, but with legs bent, either to the left or right.
Any specific orientation?
Head usually towards the east. And often, the body was sprinkled with ochre, that red pigment.
Ochre comes up a lot in ancient burials, doesn't it?
It does. Its symbolism is debated, but it's a recurring theme. And later in the Repan period, you start seeing megalithic elements too, like stone circles within the burial mounds.
And the Afanasevo culture, the ones who split off early.
They migrated east, likely from the middle Volga-Ural area around 3700, 3500 BC, and their culture looks very similar to Repan Kurgans, pastoralism, metallurgy. It reinforces that shared origin.
Okay, so we have this picture. Mobile pastoralists, horse masters, sky god venerators, burying their dead in Kurgans with specific rituals. Now let's draw the line to India. How do we get from Yamnaya to the Vedic people?
This is where the steppe hypothesis really comes into play. It's the dominant model for explaining the spread of Indo-European languages.
Right, the idea that these languages, and maybe culture and religion too, spread out from the Pontic Caspian steppe.
Exactly. The Yamnaya culture, around 3300–2600 BCE, is strongly associated with speakers of late PIE or early Indo-European. Fast forward over a millennium to around 1500 BCE, and you have the Vedic people composing the Vedas in India.
In Vedic Sanskrit, which is an Indo-European language.
Precisely. The hypothesis suggests that the ancestors of these Vedic people, the Indo-Aryans, were steppe populations related genetically and culturally to the Yamnaya. They migrated eastward first.
Forming intermediate cultures like Santashta and Andronovo.
Yes, those are key archaeological cultures in Central Asia associated with the Indo-Iranian branch of Indo-European. Then, groups moved south from Central Asia into the Indian subcontinent.
So, Vedic religion isn't just similar to Yamnaya beliefs, it could be a direct descendant, evolved over time.
That's the argument. It's seen as carrying forward core elements of that Proto-Indo-European religious system transmitted via these migrating steppe groups.
What are some of the clearest inherited concepts? You mentioned the sky father.
That's probably the most direct linguistic and conceptual link. Vedic Gyopyate is unmistakably derived from the reconstructed PIE dies for star.
The name itself carries through.
It does. And you see parallels with other Vedic deities too. Ut-Az, the dawn goddess, seems cognate with the PIE dawn goddess. Surya, the sun god, also fits the PIE pattern. Maybe even aspects of Indra, the warrior god, and Agni, the fire god, have PIE roots, though their roles evolved significantly.
What about bigger ideas like cosmology?
The Vedic concept of Atta, this idea of cosmic order, truth, the proper functioning of the universe, is widely thought to derive from a similar PIE concept about universal law and order.
And social structure. I remember reading about a reconstructed PIE social model.
Yes, the tripartite ideology: priests, warriors, and producers-commoners. Many scholars see echoes of this in the early Vedic class divisions: the Brahmana priests, Kshatriya warriors, and Vaishya commoners.
Okay, that's the conceptual framework. What about actual practices, rituals, symbols? You mentioned horses earlier.
Right. The huge importance of the horse for Yamnaya mobility and probably status seems directly reflected in the Vedic Ashwamedha.
The horse sacrifice, a major royal ritual in ancient India.
A very elaborate and significant one. It suggests that deep reverence for the horse traveled with these groups from the steppes. Fire rituals are another huge link.
Agni, the fire god, is central in the Vedas.
Absolutely central. And the yajna, the fire sacrifice, is the core Vedic ritual act. While fire reverence isn't unique, the specific prominence and form it takes in Vedic ritual likely has deep roots in PIE and steppe traditions.
And what about Soma, the sacred drink?
Ah, Soma, or Haoma, in the related Iranian tradition. This sacred intoxicating drink, central to Vedic and early Iranian ritual, is widely believed to have originated somewhere on the steppes, probably within the later Indo-Iranian cultures like Santashta or Andronovo, which descended from Yamnaya-related groups.
So a shared Indo-Iranian thing, post-Yamnaya, but pre-split.
That seems likely, yeah. Even burial customs offer clues, though it's complex. Yamnaya practiced inhumation in Kurgans. Vedic culture predominantly shifted to cremation.
A big change.
It is. But interestingly, the intermediate Andronovo culture shows evidence of both inhumation and cremation, sometimes even cremated remains placed within kurgans. This might represent a transitional phase, but the underlying concern for elaborate funerary rites seems continuous.
And there's other evidence supporting this migration story. Archaeology, genetics.
Yes, archaeology traces a plausible path. You can follow a trail of related cultural markers, certain types of pottery, metalwork, chariot burials associated with Santashta and Andronovo moving from the Urals eastward and then southward towards India and Iran.
And genetics backs this up.
Increasingly so. Genetic studies show clear evidence of significant ancestry contributions from Yamnaya-related steppe populations into South Asia, especially noticeable in groups like the Brahmins, the traditional priestly class who preserve Vedic texts.
But obviously things change. Vedic religion isn't identical to what we reconstruct for PIE or Yamnaya.
Of course not. Thousands of years, vast distances, new environments, new neighbors. Things inevitably evolve. In India, there was significant interaction with indigenous cultures, Dravidian speakers, Munda speakers. Elements were absorbed, beliefs blended.
Did the gods change?
Roles shifted. Indra, for example, becomes arguably the most prominent god in the Rig Veda, perhaps overshadowing Dyaus Pitar. New deities might have emerged, older ones faded or changed character.
And practices adapted, too.
Naturally. Different plants available for rituals, different climate, different social needs. The shift to cremation is a major adaptation. And then later developments within India itself, the Upanishads, the rise of Buddhism and Jainism, led to further profound transformations.
So it's a clear lineage, but with lots of evolution along the way. Makes sense. Now, let's pivot to Zoroastrianism. The source connects it through that same shared Indo-Iranian heritage, right?
Exactly. The link works through the same pathway. The ancient Iranian speakers of Avestan, Old Kurgan, are also traced back linguistically, genetically, archaeologically to those Indo-Iranian steppe cultures, Santashta and Andronovo, emerging around 2100–1400 BCE.
Which were, in turn, influenced by or descended from earlier Yamnaya-related groups.
Precisely. So Yamnaya represents that deeper PIE source transmitted via the Indo-Iranian stage, which is the common ancestor of both Vedic and early Iranian traditions, including Zoroastrianism. They inherited foundational PIE elements through those shared ancestors.
So what specific things do Vedic and Avestan, the language of the oldest Zoroastrian texts, share that point back to this common past?
Well, first, the languages themselves, Vedic Sanskrit and Avestan, are extremely closely related, sister languages. That's a huge clue.
Like Spanish and Portuguese, almost.
Maybe even closer in some respects, especially in their archaic forms. Then you have the ritual drinks. Avestan Haoma is the direct cognate of Vedic Soma. The names, the associated rituals, very similar, pointing strongly to that shared steppe origin.
Okay, Soma Haoma again. What else?
Fire veneration. Avestan Atar, fire, and Vedic Agni, fire, both hold absolutely central roles. This intense focus on fire almost certainly goes back to shared PIE reverence, but it's particularly strong in the Indo-Iranian branches and remains fundamental in Zoroastrian worship today.
The cosmic order idea, too.
Yes, Avestanaya, often translated as truth, righteousness, order, is the linguistic and conceptual cognate of Vedic Ta. Both concepts are absolutely central to the respective worldviews.
And divine terminology. You mentioned Ahura earlier.
Right. This is fascinating because it shows both connection and divergence. Avesta and Ahura, meaning Lord, especially in the supreme god's name, Ahura Mazda, wise Lord, is cognate with Vedic Asura.
But Asura in later Vedic texts often means demon or anti-god.
Exactly. While initially Asura might have referred to powerful, perhaps older gods in Vedic, it generally took on negative connotations later. In contrast, the Iranians elevated Ahura to the highest divine status. This points to a major split.
Ah, the famous Devadaiva split.
That's the one. It's a defining feature of Zarathustra's reforms. The word for god in Vedic, deva, becomes deva in Avestan, meaning demon or false god.
So gods on one side became demons on the other.
Essentially, yes. It looks like a conscious rejection of certain deities or aspects of the shared polytheistic past. Gods prominent in Vedic hymns, like Indra, are explicitly demonized in Avestan texts.
That's a radical shift. What other major changes did Zoroastrianism introduce?
A much stronger, more explicit ethical dualism. The cosmic struggle between the holy good Ahura Mazda, associated with truth, and the destructive spirit Angra Mainyu, or Ahriman, associated with Druj, the lie, becomes central. Human beings have free will to choose sides in this cosmic battle.
More dualistic than Vedic thought.
Generally, yes, especially compared to the early Vedic texts. And there's a strong tendency towards monotheism, or at least a very clear hierarchy with Ahura Mazda as the supreme uncreated god, even while acknowledging other benevolent divine beings, the Yazatas or venerable ones.
Ethereal practices, that was another difference.
A huge difference. We had Yamnaya inhumation, Vedic cremation. Zoroastrianism developed the practice of exposing the dead, traditionally on towers of silence, or dogmas.
Why the exposure?
To avoid polluting the sacred elements, earth, fire, water, with decaying matter. It's a radical departure driven by specific theological concerns about purity.
So again, shared roots, but a very distinct path taken by Zoroastrianism due to Zarathustra's reforms. Okay, now for the third connection, Tengrism. The source seemed much more cautious here.
And rightly so. This is a different kind of connection, much more indirect and, frankly, speculative. There's no demonstrable line of descent like we see with Vedic and Zoroastrian traditions.
Why not? What are the main obstacles?
Well, first, the timescale. A huge gap. Yamnaya is 3rd millennium BCE. Tengrism as a distinct religious system really comes into focus with the Turkic and Mongolic empires in the mid-1st millennium CE and later. We're talking maybe 3,000 years or more separating them.
And different peoples, different languages.
Exactly. Yamnaya is linked to Proto-Indo-European speakers. Tengrism is associated with Turkic and Mongolic peoples, part of the Altaic language grouping, a completely different language family.
So no direct linguistic links like Diaspitar or Soma Haoma?
None that are widely accepted. The proposed connections are based more on similarities arising from a shared environment and lifestyle.
Both steppe pastoralists?
Largely, yes.
Yeah.
Both cultures were deeply shaped by life on the vast Eurasian steppe. The open landscapes, the dependence on herds, the importance of horses. That kind of environment can foster certain similar religious outlooks.
Like focusing on the sky.
That's one key parallel often discussed. We have the Pie Sky Father, Dais Fator, likely important for Yamnaya, and in Tengrism, the central deity is Tengri, often Kök Tengri, the blue sky, or eternal sky.
A supreme sky god in both cases.
Yes, but it's crucial to note that Tengri is not believed to linguistically derive from Divasfair. The similarity is more likely convergent evolution. Similar environments, similar nomadic lifestyles perhaps, leading to a focus on the overarching ever-present sky as the supreme power. Or maybe it taps into a much older, shared Eurasian spiritual archetype that predates even Pie.
Interesting. What about the Kurgans? Did Timrissic peoples use them?
Yes, Kurgan burials persisted on the steppe for millennia after the Yamnaya. Scythians used them, and later Turkic and Mongolic groups associated with Tengrism also built various forms of burial mounds.
So a continuity of practice, maybe?
A continuity of the form of burial, perhaps? It suggests a long-term tradition of mound building in the region. But the specific rituals, the cosmology, the beliefs associated with those burials undoubtedly changed drastically over time. Tengristic burials had their own logic tied to their specific worldview.
Any other potential parallels? Nature worship? Ancestors?
Both seem likely for Yamnaya, inferred from archaeology and the Pie context. And Tengrism definitely has a strong emphasis on venerating nature spirits, sacred mountains, trees, water alongside Tengri, and also reverence for ancestor spirits. Shamans often acted as intermediaries.
But again, those features are common in many traditional religions tied to the land, aren't they?
They absolutely are, which makes it hard to distinguish between direct, ancient transmission and convergence, or just common responses to living closely with nature and remembering one's lineage.
So, to sum up the Tengrism link, it's not parent-child, more like distant neighbors shaped by the same landscape.
That's a good way to put it. The source used the analogy of distinct cousins in the same vast garden. They adapted similarly to the climate of steppe nomadism, maybe drew on some common soil of ancient underlying beliefs, perhaps even going back to something as old as the Repan culture, as a shared influence, but ultimately developed along separate lines. The similarities are noticeable, but a direct inheritance from Yamnaya seems unlikely given the gaps in time, language, and specific beliefs.
This has been incredibly illuminating, tracing these ancient connections and also seeing where the lines blur or break. So just to recap the main threads we've followed.
Sure. We've seen a strong case for the Yamnaya culture as a key archaeological proxy for late Proto-Indo-European speakers, being an ancestral source for core spiritual concepts found in both Vedic religion and Zoroastrianism. This connection runs through their shared Indo-Iranian heritage, which developed on the steppes after the main Yamnaya period but carried forward many of its legacies.
But both Vedic and Zoroastrian traditions also underwent significant evolution and transformation in their new homelands and through internal developments or reforms.
Absolutely. Clear continuities, but also major changes. Then with Tengrism, the connection is much more tenuous. It's less about direct lineage and more about potential parallels arising from a shared steppe environment, similar lifestyles, and maybe some very ancient, deeply buried cultural currents across Eurasia, rather than specific Yamnaya beliefs being passed down directly.
It really makes you appreciate the immense timescales involved and how ideas ripple outwards, change, and sometimes resurface in different forms.
It certainly does. It's a powerful reminder of how environment, migration, cultural mixing, and just the passage of time shape something as fundamental as spiritual beliefs. Maybe something for you, the listener, to ponder is, what underlying human questions or needs are being addressed by these different traditions, even with their divergent paths but shared roots? Think about that enduring power of the sky or the importance of ancestors' themes that resonate across so many cultures, perhaps pointing to something fundamental in how we try to understand our place in the cosmos.